next episode of Leaders for Humanity. Today, my co-host Otti and I are very much looking forward to talk to Mike O'Donnell, a political sociologist who is belonging to these rare few thinkers out there looking at realistic utopias. We are going to learn what alternatives to neoliberalism are imaginable and how alternative forms of organizing for a new society can be brought together to form a new or renewed radical democratic society. But Otti will do a much more thorough introduction of our guest in a moment, and hence I will, as usual, start with a very brief recap on the Good Organizations Inquiry Project. Otti and I decided about a year ago to set time in our lives and professions apart for an inquiry about what good is in the context of modern business. What can organizations in this complex and demanding environment of the 21st century do to contribute as responsible actors to society? How can they act as synergetic engines for the communities that they serve? And how can they be trustees for the growth and development of humans to become better versions of themselves? In this journey, we try to involve lots of free thinkers with interesting ideas. Researchers who can then take some of these ideas and qualify them in regards to empirical evidence. And finally, last but not least, politicians and business leaders who might be willing to experiment, hopefully, with some of these bold new ideas to see if together in a pragmatic fashion we can move forward. And with that, straight over to you, Otti, for proper introductions.
Wonderful, thank you very much. And I have to say, it's an immense pleasure, Mike, to welcome you to our inquiry, because Antoinette and I have been searching for people who have a vision on where democratic political systems could go. And about a year and a half ago, we came across an article that you wrote, and I think it was hosted by the University of Westminster, on institutional democracy. And it caught our interest forever. And at some stage, we contacted you. And I'm very, very glad to see you here today with us. So again, a big thank you for being here. And in introducing you properly, so as Antoinette already pointed out, Mike is an emeritus professor of sociology at the University of Westminster, has also been an author of two very, very interesting books, which here we recommend to everybody to read. One on the Crisis and Popular Dissent, a book that is here, Divided West is the subtitle. And it's a very interesting analysis on the notion of populism, progressive liberalism in a historical context, but also in a sociological context. So we will talk about this more in regards to what we can see from social movements, what we can see from changes that are already happening in the society today based on the historical context, to see what possible options we have to evolve further. And as Mike said in the pre-session, it's an evolving feast. The notion of radical democracy that we will hear about a lot today is something that has been developing only for the last few years. Secondly, of course, the crux of our today's conversation will be about alternatives to neoliberalism, a work of Mike O'Donnell, together with Bryn Jones, who unfortunately is unable to be here today. We wanted to really offer you a dialogue with both Mike and Bryn, but unfortunately, due to some personal circumstances at the very last minute, Bryn sends his excuses. And I think to conclude this very haphazard introduction, Mike, you're also someone who is widely taught, especially in the UK context, but also in the United States, and also has been engaged with scholars all over Europe. And in the book, you will see some analyses of context, for example, in Greece with the social movements, in Spain, as much as a little bit on the Nordic country and, for example, Germany. So an interesting analysis from a clear UK perspective, but taking into account a little bit what is happening all over the world. And with that, I would say that is most certainly not a sufficient introduction. So, Mike, could I possibly ask you maybe to present yourself? How would you describe yourself? What brings you to this analysis? And what are all the interesting things that we have missed in our introduction?
I'm going to start in a surprising place. At about the year of 12, I was sent to a seminary to train for the priesthood. Needless to say, at the age of 12, I didn't have much idea of what that might mean. But I think the values, the Christian values I learnt there have stayed with me, although I'm a humanist now rather than a Christian. What I did react against, and it's probably apparent in my work, was what I experienced as a boy, really, the extreme hierarchy of the Catholic Church. So that might be the seeds of my strong commitment to democracy and participation, that I don't like hand-me-down rules. I prefer for rules and a society to evolve with the maximum participation of the people in it, rather than single or leaders or oligarchies. Probably the next very powerful formative moment was 1968. I like to think I'm older than I'm younger than I look, but anyway, I was there in '68 in America, and I was ignited really by what I found there, the movement, the civil rights movement, which was a little bit before I arrived, but really the '68. I was at the Chicago Convention as a radical protesting against the war, but very influenced by the counterculture as well. And I see some parallels in the counterculture and the attempt to not only to counter the dominant capitalists and rather military culture at the time, but to form an alternative, very much as the article Antoinette sent me is happening now, to build up networks, connections that are alternative to the dominant capitalist mode, much more participatory and mutually supportive.
Very interesting. Reminds me, Antoinette, of the discussion with Paul Adler, where he said he came from that bubbling environment of being born to two parents who were part of the communist movement at the time, and then found himself in France as an advisor to the government on social policy. So very interesting to see the genesis of some of the thoughts. And of course, we're intrigued by your mentioning of Catholics, so this whole Catholic social teaching, which we recently discussed with Lugino Bruno. So I'm sure we're going to come back to that in a second. Antoinette, any further questions you want to ask in this section?
Yeah, I'm also, of course, very inspired by what you just said, because I would have wanted to be able to hear to some people who were active in the civil rights movement. And we are soon going to have Bill Torbert up, and he was very active in the civil rights movement. And why do I mention that here? Because we asked him, what does leading a good life mean for you at this stage of life? And he told us, having good questions. Now, of course, I'm very curious, after the journey you were showing us, what is it for you? So a very personal question. What does leading a good life mean for you personally?
I think it's always continuing to learn and keep up with events, but also to continue to express what experience and wisdom I've got. As I say, I like to think that as a person, I'm fairly informal and approachable, and my ethos is one of communication and supportive. Probably as a character, I'm somewhat introverted, but you can't stay in education for decades and just remain that way. So I would say the early values of being the simple word is kind to other people, has stayed with me. Put a little bit more in terms of jargon, I would say that mutually supportive relationships are the basis of society at the smaller scale, and should be at the larger level as well.
Very nice. And I think, I mean, it resonates with Jane Dutton, who was talking about high quality relations all the time. And even we had a discussion with the Finnish philosopher Frank Martela, and he was talking about caring connections. So it's I think a theme that is across our work. But I think it will be very interesting to see how it features in your work, because I think the tension between individual right and caring connections is something that we want to explore explicitly. But I have to ask you one more question, Mike, because I mean, we really enjoyed preparing for this session, but we were also swearing a little bit when it came to what we found was sometimes quite ideological political language in the books that you've written. So what is the story with Labour Party left-wing politics? What's your relationship with political parties or politics as such? Because you seem to be speaking from a caring for the survival and re-energizing of the left, so to speak. Is that how you would position yourself, even as an academic, or how would you describe your relationship?
Okay, well, just continuing the influence of the United States on me, I think the biggest intellectual influence on me, certainly as a younger man, an academic, was Charles Wright Mills. And among other things, he developed a non-Marxist, but not anti-Marxist, but view of society, which was based on an elite analysis of society, three elites, the military, the political, and the economic. And people differ on this, but I think Mills was never actually a Marxist. And I've never actually been a Marxist. So I've slightly uncomfortably been positioned as almost at times it feels like a lone Millsian. And then suddenly in recent years, the people elite analysis came back very strongly. So I related to that. I mean, people were not talking so much about the ruling class, but about elites. And I see traction in that analysis. I'm somewhat of a much less of an economic determinist. In fact, I even gag on the word determinist a bit than perhaps Olin Wright. I think I see these three areas as Mills did, as people moving between them in the power elite. In fact, what he thought, and it might have some relevance to current day Russia, he thought that America in the late 50s, this was really before the Vietnam War, that the dominant elite was the military. I don't actually agree, but I can see his point.
Very interesting. And I think on the one hand, one other book that I think we want to recommend, and Antoinette, maybe this is something we should point out some of the reading before we start so people can contextualize what follows. But one work that will come up in our discourse, I'm sure, a few times is Karl Polanyi's The Great Transformation. And I think in this context, the notion of disembeddedness, I think, is very important. And here you suggest, but I think Antoinette and I have come to a similar conclusion, that kind of businesses are always political in as much as they're organs of society, an expression of a certain mental model, but also they have to be political because they probably need to very profoundly think about how they want to influence the world that they're in. So I think this notion of there might be a necessity to, as a citizen, but also organizations, to be close to politics, and that might imply political parties. I think it's something that is very interesting to explore, because traditionally businesses certainly have tried to be seen as not political at all, but they are intrinsically. So I guess that is something that will come back in a second when we speak about transformation. So I think, Antoinette, maybe over to you to introduce the structure.
Yes, of course. Let me offer some contextualization for our dialogue. Mike is squarely in the realm of political sociology, and he thinks more on a system level, and hence we adapted our structure to some degree. In the first section, we want to focus on morality, philosophy, and what a good society is, but we zoom quickly on what seems to be a common headache for reform, neoliberalism, and then discuss its alternatives. We then, in a second part, operationalize better on the level of societal order and learn about different forms of radical democracy. We then switch to the level of businesses and ask if and how business organizations can become a part of the struggle towards the good. And finally, we go into transformation and find out if and how we can transform our societies, reforming them, or whether in the end we still need a revolution. And with that, now I give over to the reformer Otti to start, please, with the first question of our first section.
Wonderful. Kind of, how do you define good? And what is the relevance for you of moral principles? You already alluded a little bit to Catholic Church. In your books, you're writing about values like equality, like rights to participate, a lot of the intrinsic right of democratic freedom, civic participation. How would you? But I had the feeling you were skewing. You were avoiding the question of kind of moral philosophy. I've looked at your references. I couldn't find any philosophers, frankly. Whereas you say explicitly, you need a coherent, genuinely social philosophy to actually frame your work. So what is good? What is morality in the context of good? How would you frame it?
Well, I think a society, if I can approach it perhaps more from the sociological point of view and then get to values, that must achieve a balance between order and freedom. And the two are connected in the sense that you're not going to have much freedom if there's chaos. Order tends to appeal more to the conservative personality, and freedom, I think, somewhat more to the radical, with the exception that economic freedom obviously has a lot of appeal to conservatives. Now, order isn't just something out there to be imposed. For me, the point of order is to meet the basic needs of society. It's much less of an end in itself than freedom and autonomy, which I tend to see as the area of creativity. Now, to achieve autonomy, you need to have access to resources. So that puts me in the direction of equality as well. So I've produced as basic values equality, autonomy, or freedom, and some order, which you could say is a little bit closer to solidarity than some would suggest. Looking at the article that Antoinette gave me to read, I found that trio was not that far from Olin Wright, actually, and what he commits to. So I've got a very strong view, really, of freedom in the sense of self and expression within society. So my vision of society, and again, it was partly inspired by the 60s, goes well beyond need or necessity. Though a society must meet the basic needs of people. You can put it in psychoanalytic terms, food, shelter, but also the higher needs of self-expression. A good society, for me, is providing the means for people to individually, but within a collective context, and that involves a lot of collectivity, a lot of provision of resources. A good society is enabling. I have a problem with the sort of the lack of vision of many societies. That they're not reaching for the full expression of either individual or human potential.
But can I come in there with one follow-up, and then I think we will go to the next session. But I have so for me, ethics or moral philosophy, to a large degree, is the mediation between individual and collective. Right, so it's really this notion of order is not either collectivist or individualist. It's really that endless paradox of me as an individual, me versus me as a member of a group or a society. So ethical norms, so to speak, or morality as a science is really about what is a good action based on thinking about me in the context of the world. So is there not a risk that by emphasizing individual freedom, whereas you say contextualized, right? But you're putting the focus clearly on freedom. Are we not perpetuating exactly the same underlying issue as Polanyi points out? The issue with the market society is that there's too much individualism, right? So the fact is that we are nurturing that, as you call it yourself, the individuals are best placed to pursue and protect their own self-interest. Yeah, but that never was really. That is part of the problem in many regards. So is there not a tension that needs to be explicitly addressed?
Yeah, I'll come back to the main thrust of your question in a moment. But Polanyi wasn't against markets necessarily. He thought that traditional Marxists, which tended to be to a large extent localized, but obviously not entirely. I suppose if you go back far enough in human history, the markets were exchange, was virtually barter, and they were totally localized. But in the medieval period, they were less localized, but very much still locally sourced. What the markets he finds takes exception to is capitalism, which disembedded communal markets and generated to bear more on the question of individuality, tended more to the accretion of individual wealth at the exploitation of human labor, and we're seeing disastrously in our own time natural resources and the climate change. So there is that side to individuality, a better notion of individualism, and I think it does pertain to liberalism as much as socialism. It's in part a rights notion, life, liberty, and I would not, as Locke said in the 17th century, say property. It's life, liberty, and I wouldn't, as Tom Jefferson said, I wouldn't say the pursuit of happiness. It's a bit too nice and twee, although he wasn't a perfect man by any means, but he had some courage to not to write property in the Declaration of Independence, but the pursuit of happiness. So it's very very ambitious and far-sighted. I wouldn't say that, though. I'd say fulfillment. But the socialist in me would say we are a social animal. We have varying potential. I don't like to see it wasted in anybody. And we need each other, and we need institutions to get it moving, to express it. So I've not found very congenial the tendency of some on the left, perhaps the Labour left, to dismiss the 60s as just another example of selfishness. In fact, I think it was testing boundaries of human expression, as some of the alternative movements are now. I can relate to that. I think somewhere in my recent book I said, bread, yes, shelter, food, but also roses, and roses is a symbol for let what can bloom bloom. But
I thought that was Rosa Luxemburg, but I think Antoinette, where I think you are closest, Mike, is an Amartya Sen notion of development is freedom, because the capability approach clearly resonates with the core needs and the core economy that we will come to in terms of freedom being an expression. But Amartya Sen is equally careful in framing it as social freedom. He says freedom is co-constructed by the society. So I think we find this ambivalence as you describe it. Okay, Antoinette?
Okay, where I wanted to go at is that you are, of course, also looking at re-embedding mechanisms.
But yes, I think split societies are obviously in danger of conflict and cause a great deal of tension, psychological as well as sometimes physical. We saw it with Brexit. So solidarity is a level of solidarity is needed. But I did mention it. I did refer to it. Yeah. I mean, I think we've a long way to go in neoliberal society before, in fact, we need to get beyond it. And I think there's an issue with you how far I would accommodate a degree of capitalism. I would certainly accommodate a degree of market activity, but capitalism I would wish to curtail very, very considerably.
Maybe let's start here, because so from a notion of what is good, which is our starting point, maybe let's go to neoliberalism, because you're explicitly articulating alternatives to neoliberalism. And I think, as you just already mentioned, in neoliberalism, so to speak, there's a free market dynamic, but there's also a value dynamic. So could you explain for us and the people listening how you frame neoliberalism, and maybe, as you mentioned earlier, in juxtaposition to liberalism? So what's the neoliberalism that you are arguing against to a degree? And maybe, because you have a very interesting historic analysis, if you want to throw in some thoughts about how it emerged, right? Why are we where you are? You mentioned a few times that Margaret Thatcher, I think at some stage in the 80s, mentioned kind of Tony Blair as our biggest achievement, meaning that we've gotten neoliberalism, so to speak, installed in people's mind. And you bring out the notion, very interesting, of governmentality, a concept that Foucault mentions. You're talking about the superstructure in a Marxist sense of culture. So you're bringing out this notion that neoliberalism, you say, is very elusive, but very pervasive. So can you bring that to life for us a little bit?
Okay, well, starting with liberalism, it really came to the fore initially in the 17th century. In Britain, it was carried by the rising merchant class, which it was a period in which you got the beginnings of a bourgeois or a business society replacing the feudal society, and amongst other things, the king's head rolled as part of that. And then there was a sort of rapprochement between the monarchy and the aristocracy and the business classes. So human rights although it's become more than a class based set of values, life, liberty. I mean, Locke did propose it as property, and the diggers, the lower levels of the parliamentary army, they try to express their desire for rights actually in property terms. They argued that their bodies, let's say, put on the line in the war against them, that was their property. So let us in, please. But of course they weren't let in. The franchise remained very limited. So I'm very well aware, and some people would belabor human rights because of their bourgeois origin. I think they have actually transcended that.
As did Karl Marx very extensively, by the way.
Yeah. Well, I disagree with him. I think you could also argue that in the Enlightenment, which find myself mentioning Jefferson again, we consider these things to be self-evident, that all should be people, not men, are created equal, and that each is entitled, I'm paraphrasing, to life, liberty, and in other words, human rights. They changed from it being referred to as natural by Locke to human with Jefferson. I think they have legs. They have survived, and they can be adapted and added to, and have been. And there are, if we're beyond religious-based societies, and in the West we are, then human rights and humanism are not a bad basis. So you could relate that to the human rights philosophy, to socialism, in the sense that it was concerned with a wider, well, initially it was limited to some extent. It was the working class, and the baddies were the dominant class. But in the post-Second World War situation, social democracy, it had a rights notion, but it was also very materially based. Now, the problems with liberalism began with neoliberalism. What neoliberalism did was break up the social democratic consensus, which was very strong in parts of Europe and Britain, and to some degree in the United States. I mean, the Kennedy's government, this is disputatious, but was intended to be reforming. What Reagan and Thatcher believed was that particularly the strength of labour was too much, and that the capital should be set free, it should be relieved of the chains of labour, and Thatcher particularly weakened the unions, and over a period of time the union membership has dropped in Britain, and it was always relatively low in the States. But they introduced following Hayek and von Mises, the Austrian liberals, they regarded the market as the basis on which to build society, that human relations are best based on economic relations. There is a faint echo in Marxist analysis that the infrastructure is initially the economy and stratification, and on that is the superstructure. So there is a kind of economic similarity to that extent. But Thatcher and Reagan then pursued policies that released capital, weakened labour, and generated this is also somewhat debatable, but largely reduced spending on social welfare and created a culture in which not to work, not to achieve, in that limited sense, was not acceptable. It wasn't in Britain that it wasn't going to really grip until, rather bizarrely, Thatcher celebrated the victory in the Falklands War and dressed as Boadicea and went through parts of the country in that sort of style. So neoliberalism marries pretty well with nationalism, but it then became international and even more capitalist centered. And I mean, I prefer to use fairly neutral language, but I will say it was certainly selfish in both an individual and class sense. However, people like Hayek, Thatcher, they believe it intensely. They intensely believe that capitalist market activity, the free market, that's their notion of freedom. It's absolutely not mine. And over a period of time, I think it generated problems that we're dealing with now.
So the first thing what I'm hearing is it started with the idea that we do have a different way, a different road to freedom, let's put it this way, but you already started the analysis that of course it could be also seen that just the power shifted. So we still have a power concentration, but it just shifted. It might have shifted to the finance sector or to finance capitalism, or it might have shifted to the big corporations, which in a globalized world just meet very weak national states. So, I mean, that's one thing to look at it, that we just have a different power concentration. And in that sense, there is not really more freedom. That's the first thing I would maybe want to go a little bit deeper. And the other thing you are now also saying, of course, is this individualism, which is at the core, because we do have the aggregation by the market and the rest are just individuals, and magically everything is aggregated. So that's another thing, of course, you were already alluding to. How can we bring back in the current situation some sense of togetherness, or however we call it, if this individualism has been so perfectly embodied in 2022, even if neoliberalism might have a crisis. But maybe I was giving you too many questions. So first, maybe let's have a look at the power
dynamics.
Of the power dynamics.
Yeah, and if I can build on that, Mike, if Antoinette, if I take your first question, right? So the idea was, as you said, Thatcher and Reagan were convinced that free markets, perfect competition would lead to no abuse, or to an equal distribution or decentralization of power. And I think there's also a little bit in Polanyi where he talks about the double movement, the counter movement. So whenever there was too much business, so to speak, there would be a counter, like you say, the social democracy in Europe, especially after the war. There was a countering of that economic logic. And this double movement was constantly like a game, right? Was reacting to each other. But I think within Polanyi, I do read that he believes that it is illusionary to think that this dual movement can work, because at the very basis of that is an economic rationale, where, as he says, land, labor, and money are fictitious commodities. They should never come under any economic rationale. So this counter movement is doomed to fail, because you should never see these type of goods, so to speak, in an economic instrumentalist fashion. So I think the two notions here is the counter movement not working because, as Antoinette says, actually we have power concentration in finance, in big corporations, so the free market has failed to avoid power? Or is it failing because it was always doomed to fail, because an economic rationality for these things like land and labor is ever going to be doomed to break down at some stage? What's your perspective?
Well, basically, I think neoliberalism exploited labor. There was a period in the United States and here when wages tracked there's very little real increase in the level of wages. Unfortunately, so there was a considerable degree of social unrest. I should add that some of it was due, although I support relatively high levels of immigration across Europe, part of the unrest, as well as being economically based, that neoliberalism was not distributing wealth fairly or adequately. There was a lot, the scapegoating of that was very often immigrants. And those two factors, a rather nationalist response to immigration and the travails, the faults of neoliberalism in terms of over-concentrating wealth to an absurd degree, so that you get you've got billionaires that are richer than small countries, that level of inequality. So there was a, whether it quite fits Polanyi's schema, I'm not sure, but there's certainly been a reaction. Unfortunately, through having looked at the growth of right populism in Europe in the post sort of 60s era, that has been the strongest reaction to the social and political issues that I've mentioned, rather than there was a left populist reaction as well, and it was articulated in both cases in elite terms, and at times they share the same rhetoric, but neither of them have produced yet an alternative. So we're living in a situation in which it's still there's a global neoliberalism, but there is rising nationalist elements as well. Trump failed really to put America first in the way that he would have liked to do, and again, without overcomplicating, the rise of China is another factor in the mix. So Polanyi's notion was that the three elements that you mentioned, land, labor, and money, are really should be part of the commons, and part of the counter movement to neoliberalism is to try and articulate ways in which the commons, land, the dignity and the rewards of labor, that should get a much larger part of the pie. And it fits reasonably with Marxism if you exclude totalitarian Marxism, which Marx perhaps didn't intend. But that's the direction I see, that the reaction against neoliberalism was partly the search for identity through nationalism, and it was on the right that people, ordinary people on the right, realized that they weren't getting a fair deal. They were seeing these celebrities and incredibly, immensely rich people who they were supposed to admire, and perhaps they did at one level, but at another level, people were struggling. Left populism, of course, and the left more generally had a very, very different view of the solution, largely, partly socialist, but also a lot of concern about the destruction of mainly the capitalist economy, but also China and elsewhere of the environment. That's, I think, the younger activists have quite rightly, in terms of their own future and the future of the planet, that's been a motor of powerful motivation. So that's happened, but it's been fairly low key. It's probably in Britain expressed as much as anybody in the Corbyn movement, which was defeated by Brexit, which is nationalistic, right populism, people like Farage. In France, Macron, in a sense, although he's very, very middle of the road, did play a MasterCard that he checked the Le Pen's, Marine Le Pen, almost by playing a populist card himself. He formed a party and went to the people and said, I am a more moderate, I want to make France prosperous, and I myself am rather wonderful, and it worked. So it's a mixed picture. In the States, given a chance to go with Trump again and all his works and pomps, a pretty disgusting man. People actually chose a late septuagenarian of a fairly traditional kind, a fairly patently decent man. So that was reassuring. But the threat is there. So alas, the counter reaction to neoliberalism has been populism, national populism, as got a number of the political sociologists call it. The left is struggling somewhat, but there's obviously particular traction with the notion of commons. And
while you are talking, I just feel very strongly that we might leave another driver out here, and I think this is a very serious driver if we don't find any means against it. So I like to go back a little bit to what you also said. We are this individualistic society. We are a hedonic society. I even read an article that even in collectivistic culture nowadays, self-optimizing ourselves and with a smile on our face, so to say, is what we do. This is at the moment our most precious idea. And I cannot see that people want to contribute to what you were saying. Like, I mean, we are having the Greens, we are having young people marching in the street, but what that would mean in the end is that we all have to really give up a lot of things, that we might even have to suffer for some time. And I kind of do not see, maybe you have solutions, but I think we also need to talk about the solutions. How can we make sure that we understand that this is now the hour where we have to do something for the common good in order to get out of this neoliberal treadmill we seem to be in?
Yeah. And can I add just one thing? So I think, as Antoinette pointed out, so the hedonic aspect of people love consumption, right? So this governmentality aspect is people actually enjoy a lot of the positive aspects of capitalism, and the revolutionary potential. I mean, even after the 2008 crisis, so you describe Occupy, but that was the 50 people on Wall Street for a winter and then it disappeared, right? So I think there's is there not the governmentality aspect? Is it not also that actually people have grown used to the comfort, to that individualistic notion of freedom of choice? They often do not participate. The youngest very often don't vote. Yes, there are social movements, but they're not very engaged in political debate today. So is there not something that, as Antoinette says, if we are overlooking that there is a very strong, somehow there's something nasty going on, right? There's capitalism, Luigino Bruno said, is bringing out the worst in us, and we are kind of getting addicted to that. So is there not something which comes in the way of what you describe, which sounds like people are starting to wake up and challenge the distribution of power and they want to participate? Is there not a tension there?
Part of the problem is that capitalism is to some degree quite popular. You're almost that people like consumption.
And it has brought significant benefits to the lives of many, right? As you described, the middle class wasn't part of Marx's plan. It was like labor versus the capital. Well, that is not really describing the sociological context today anymore.
Well, I mean, I'll say with that point then, the structure, I think the most popular structure of model of society that the left has adopted has been the elite people. Well, that's certainly the populist model. I see another way of formulating it is the elite and the precariat. Now, the precariat is not just the people on the margin of society, who I still pass in. I'm in East Finchley, North London, on my way to the supermarket or whatever. There are people on the margin, but it's actually what Theresa May referred to as the getting bys, people who feel that they're not really progressing, or it may be a relative thing, that they look at the extremes of wealth and think, well, I'm not really doing, I could be doing better, and it's not really my fault. And I mentioned before that some of the blame of that is, instead of being at the elite, although there's plenty at the elite, to be fair, there's a whole succession of elite crises, and then there's still going with the Partygate, which is a farce, really, that a government should be arraigned by is up before the police, possibly a prime minister. Possibly, it must be careful. He's not been found guilty of anything yet, but the situation is indicative of really the seediness of the whole elite thing. There've been crises with the Murdoch media as well, phone tapping. People have got. There was a certain sense of corruption, or that the elites were corrupt. And I think looking at Trump in the States and the weirdness, if you think of QAnon, that's gone around him, the attack on the Capitol, people have perceived something wrong, and it's not been bad. I mean, the system has worked enough that the majority has stayed with it. Alternatives to neoliberalism and populist nationalism have to be worked for. They are, you're right, I mean, they're perhaps not as popular as this celeb consumer society, even great as the damage it's doing. Sometimes I mean, young children are getting onto areas of social media that are extreme, they're running it for themselves better than their parents can. They're getting all over the place. You could argue that the damage, particularly the psychological, but there's a lot of material inequality, particularly globally, of the neoliberal period of capitalism is as great as the industrial capitalism. It's just somewhat different, with the climate and the psyche coming to the fore rather than material deprivation.
Yeah, and I think this is what Antoinette was trying to point to. I think beyond the power of the market, what you described there for me is an ethical problem, right? There's somehow I like this notion of governmentality. There's some sort of rationality where the economic discourse has led to almost the right of some people based on instrumental logic to behave badly, right? And that might imply that they exploit others, but it might also simply imply that they behave in very selfish ways, right? I mean, Boris Johnson, look at him, right? So, but again, there's more than 50, well, in the first past the post system of the UK, it's never 50%, but there are lots of people that have voted him, right? So, but maybe at this point, Antoinette, do we want to go to, Mike, you just said it, alternatives? Because I think that's the question now. So we have some troubles. I think we all agree on that. Now the question is, let's look at alternatives, because many people criticize, and as you say, Mike, in your book, it's not enough to criticize. We need to create some tangible options.
Well, there are obviously a lot of avenues of approach. Given that power is maldistributed, it's with the rise of these interlocking elites and the way capitalist digital globalization has inflated inequality. Power is something perhaps to aim at and to not as traditionally the left would do, only economic inequality. So we've argued, not exclusively, you shouldn't think that our emphasis on more democracy is all we have to suggest, but strengthen democratic institutions and forms would perhaps counterbalance the liberal representative democracy and the extent to which it's in the hands of global business interests and other aspects of the elite. I mean, the global elite. What do we do? Well, it's not easy. There was a shot at getting a left inclining Labour Party, and a lot of young people identified with that. But bearing on what you were saying about the popularity of capitalism and particularly nationalism and identification with the nation, Farage and Johnson won.
But what you are essentially suggesting is this institutional democracy, so the broadening and deepening of democracy. And you say this goes into businesses and the public sector and on the community level. So maybe you can just kind of outline for people who haven't yet read the book a little bit more what you mean by that. And then I already give you a little bit of a thought, of a thinking question here, because I come out of a country where we have a very strong direct on the community level democracy in Switzerland. And what I can say from the evidence we have, this is very good for participation, satisfaction with the government. We have better efficiency, we have better equality than, for instance, the UK or Germany. But there is also a but. On the level of the nation, and I often kind of discuss that with Otti, Switzerland is not much better than London. And we have a lot of egotism. We're driven still by neoliberal competition between countries. We have a lot of right populism, so right-wing populism. So I'm just kind of wondering, maybe first you explain us your model, and then also tell us what we need in addition, because I believe, sadly, I'm a big believer in this more checks and balances, but it's probably not enough.
Yeah. Just to break it off, I think any radical reform would require, I think, from the centre, or a redistribution through the tax system, various, it could be corporation tax, income tax, a tax on global companies, particularly the FANGs, the internet companies. Change, a redistribution of power would require financing, and also similarly a redistribution of resources. So that's a sort of bracket off. One of the admired models is sometimes referred to as the Preston model. It's a town you've probably heard of in the north of England. It's a kind of local socialism. It's fostered by Mayor Brown. I can describe some of the things excuse me, he's introduced. He, not just him, the local authority, they source from local resources when the local authority spends, agricultural, but across industrial skills as well. They invest locally rather than with big, perhaps southern London-based corporations. In other words, they're spending their money with local people to create a local economy. One of the things they did was there's a big covered market in right in the centre of the town, among some of the more traditional buildings, are covered, although it's been there for probably several score years. And they devoted that to, or they encouraged cooperatives there to locate there, and made funding relatively straightforward for them. And another aspect is that they involve local institutions, local universities. The police they are encouraged either to provide, in the case of the universities, their expertise for the development of the city. It was made as actually one most improved town 3 or 4 years ago, and it became a city as a reward, so it was recognized. So it's that kind of thing. Plymouth has done it way down south on the coast, has done it differently, much more in terms of social enterprise, as a civil society engagement, a group of people, some business, some professional, some employees. They formed a good ideas group, got a grant actually from the council. The local government is much involved in this, and they've now there's several hundred social enterprises, many of them in what were dead buildings, including the Guildhall, which is a sort of where the civic offices were, and many of them not being used. So that's become a hub of small business. I I'm in favour of small-scale entrepreneurship. I mean, there are other ideas to cull and control big business, but I'm starting at the bottom because I think that's where I believe we should start.
But Mike, can I, because not everybody has read the book, so I think I just want to go to Antoinette's question in the contextualization of the notion of institutional democracy for 1 second, so people don't get lost in the discourse, if I may, because I think there was as Antoinette said, I think there's one challenge intrinsic in creating the conditions for that to work. That might imply a budget from the center.
Thanks. That's not done. Thanks.
No worries at all.
Being spoiled.
Yeah, very nice. So that might imply a budget from the center to support local activity. It might, you're describing participatory budgeting, mechanisms to bring things together. I think another aspect of this is, how do you connect the local with the global? And we talked to Paul Adler about strategizing. So how do you connect what the local people do with what the state should be doing? Antoinette's point earlier, both from a contribution perspective, but also redistribution perspective. I think there's another question in, we said, actually the problem with neoliberalism is this notion of big corporations, globalization, that is not really addressed necessarily through better local interaction and so on. So these are the questions on my mind, but let me contextualize, because you said, so radical democracy is the free flowing of, if I understand you correctly, the free flowing of power across society in the right way so that people can have impact over what impacts them. You also describe it as a fourth phase of citizenship. So we went from civil to political to social citizenship, and this is about participatory citizenship, so to speak. And you say this radical democracy has to be enshrined in institutional norms at different levels. You give 4 conditions in your book. Subsidiarity, and I think that's what you're describing. So the maximum democracy as a concrete practice, but you contextualize it, and this I really liked, immediately by saying it will be mediated by feasibility and practicability, because to enable collective decision-making, there are a whole bunch of preconditions, potentially. Secondly, you say you integrate a range of democratic ideas, and you're quoting representative, direct, associative, and other forms of democracy. So again, you're saying we want participation, but how far we can go might depend on circumstances and on what the preferred model is for the type of decisions that need to be made. You say, and you're describing that now, all spheres of society should have this democratic underpinning, so to speak. And I think the fourth point is what Antoinette was pointing to, which is it requires competence. And here you say, including practical understanding of rights, duties, and responsibilities, ability to act responsibly on behalf of others, and understanding the grammar of institutions, and it's kind of framed as civic competency. So I think you're qualifying this participatory democracy immediately with a necessity to create that capacity, right? So I think that what I really liked, and I want to make one more point just in the framing. When you speak about social democracy, this was interesting for me. Social democracy refers to the famous mixed model where the state creates the regulatory environment for the market, but it's always the state and the government, as you just said, which is acting as a regulator, as a redistributor. And that contrasts very strongly with your democratization of the entire society. So I think for people, social democracy versus radical institutional democracy, it's a different mechanism. On the one hand, the state is the equalizer, right? This, I think it's called not equalizer, but so it's kind of the savior. Whereas you're saying, no, that's not going to work. It's going to create centralization of power and elites again. It needs to be everybody. So just to frame it, and here maybe, can we go a little bit to the fourth point on what are the competencies required? How do you build that ability? Because again, you're including some things even as capacity for empathy and caring and collaboration, right? So how do you build that prerequisite? And how do you fix the issues with neoliberalism by doing so?
it should begin in schools, and it should continue in university, and better through action, albeit perhaps mock elections, perhaps as well, even at primary level, involvement in the children in decision making. Democracy involves making choices between alternatives, decision making. Children can do it. They know what they like and they don't like. It could perhaps not at primary school level, but at secondary level. Why not have a student representatives on a school council? It may be limited in its sphere of decision making. It may be additional to the school board. But if you're going to have a literate and competent population, then it's got to start. It's got to start early. So that, ideally, I mean, in terms of a culture, I would argue for the presumption that democracy is the form of institutions, the dominant form, rather than hierarchy. The presumption seems to be the other way around, that certainly in the educational system and many structures are, the assumption is it's going to be top downwards. And this it's a subsidiary but important point. This is very unfulfilling. I said one of my values is fulfillment, not necessarily happiness. Well, there's a lot of work that is unfulfilling. That is a big problem. One of the ways of dealing with both with the exercise of power and the exercise of boring tasks is to rotate. That would be a very egalitarian and democratic. Moving out, certainly universities should involve students in the decisions that affect their lives. I mean, the most recent support for participatory observation, or the most in the post-war period, came from students. Actually, the students for a democratic society in the States, and they found that society, capitalism was too greedy, to put it simply. Socialism that we were seeing in Russia was too dictatorial, too totalitarian, and they were looking for a different way. And they came up with the idea of participatory participatory democracy, I should say. And that's been echoed through the social movements, and that's where I got it from initially. I've had to go beyond participatory democracy to concede that there are some institutions in which equal participation is more or less impossible. So there is representation. I'm open, and I mentioned many different. I've mentioned a couple now. Many different forms of democratic participation, representative democracy. In Britain, MPs can be subject to recall, and I think that's a delegatory democracy. One of the models often cited is Porto Alegre in Brazil, where the local areas will stipulate what they want to their delegate, who will go and represent them at the council level. A similar, somewhat different, rather lesser approach has been taken in Scotland, which is a devolved government where the central government has provided extra finance and encouragement for local communities to spend part of their funding on what they choose.
I think here, Mike, similar to the conversation with Paul Adler, I think it's nice to say there's a whole range of different ways to participate. But again, 25 years in business, I can tell you, so the fragmentation, differentiation, autonomy is not the problem. Integration is the problem. Everybody giving their demands is easy. Trying to figure out what's best for the whole, that's normally where things get messy. And hence, I think designing the participation in such a way that maybe there's limited interdependence that enables people to create contained decision-making, wherever people are interdependent on each other. And this could be businesses on the community or the community on the nation. This is, I think, where the integratory mechanisms would need to be well qualified and well defined. Do you go by advice decision-making? Do you go by consensus? Do you go by qualified majority? Who participates? Is it an expert-led process, or is it a common everybody has a voice process, as we saw with Brexit? You might not want to go for referendum if people are either unwilling, uninformed, or have all sorts of other troubles on their head, which might lead to suboptimal choices. And either way, so I think your notion of looking at the mechanisms, looking at the prerequisites, I think is really, really important. It might require some templating. And again, I think looking at some of the examples that you cite in the book could be very helpful to build up almost a library of templates to be reused in certain contingent situations for people who want to practice that and learn it through practicing, like you say, right? But I think, Antoinette, do you want to go briefly to foundational economy? Where do you want to go?
No, I think foundational economy, for one reason, that first of all, I find that very interesting. Second of all, it links in a certain way, because that's almost a top-down way to try to bring more aspirations to the common good into the picture. And probably in the end, of course, we have to combine top-down and bottom-up. So you were now saying, how can I reinstall in society the we feeling? How can I teach people to be critical again, to also be responsible again? And I do believe that's very important. But on the other side, we also need this link to the national level, to the broader economy. And here I found this idea of the foundational economy and the social license very intriguing.
It's an interesting idea, yeah.
Yeah, so, tell us a little bit, because I don't know how many people know this model. It's a very interesting one.
Yeah, well, I met it, came out of the Manchester Business School, so it's a real thing and a real business. I mean, their idea is that particularly big supermarkets, but potentially other businesses, should be subject to license. That if they won the privilege of serving a community rather than merely making a profit, I mean, putting it, you know, in terms of serving a community, then they must sign a contract. Again, local sourcing is very good for local people, local business, to be climate sensitive in what they do. And why not have, again, some at least representatives from customers on their board of governance. So what the representatives I talked to when we had a meeting from the Manchester Business School, a couple of them came down. They say realistically, you're not yet going to abolish the big supermarkets, the big corporations. So this is one way of bringing them to heel to some extent. And you know, on the issue of markets, that's one way of limiting market freedom, which is a freedom that I think is dangerous anyway. There are many other ways. Taxation is another way. There's all kinds of regulation, but I like this idea of licensing.
You could even use that because in the UK you have outsourced so many public sector services with big problem sometimes. You can of course then, once you have to renew their licenses, just kind of be more precise what you really expect of them. I found that quite intriguing. What I don't know, because I'm not a lawyer, but I mean that could even be the one chance you have now not being any longer in the European Union, because that of course wasn't probably possible as long as you were in the European Union, because there you always had to outsource to the cheapest normally supplier.
Not only cheapest, but most appropriate. But I think building on this, I found it equally interesting, because I think that the notion was the foundational economy has two characteristics. One, they directly relate to these capabilities of freedom in the Zen sense. So they're about health, they're about learning, they're about food, they're about transportation, they're about basic participatory means in becoming a citizen. Secondly, it's distributed and sheltered. So it's wide ranging, it's all across the nation, and very often is a natural monopoly kind of situation. And it's sheltered because it's not fully in the competitive market anyway. So that seem to be conditions that are, like you say, it's a state mandated type of the economy. So if that's the case, and if we are distributing the state power to the individuals and the regions or communities, then it seems an ideal mechanism. And it relates to something else that you described, which I really like, is this notion of constitution. So really a much more explicit negotiation of what do we owe to each other? What are we trying to do together? Who are we all here? Which links to, again, this bringing up the capacity for democracy. And it also reminded me, Antoinette, of Morningstar. Do you remember in Morningstar, they have these CLOUs, right? The colleague letter of understanding. So Mike, what they do is in Morningstar, because it's very participatory democracy, Morningstar is a manufacturing firm in the United States. Rather than having top-down job descriptions, they have these letters between colleagues where at the beginning of the year, they agree with each other what they're going to do for each other. And I thought that is almost like Henry Mintzberg's kind of declaration of interdependence, right? And at this point, I guess we're coming to business, and I'm watching the time a little bit because we don't want to overrun too much. If we can touch on two more critical themes. One, in your notion of institutional democracy, where it's really nice for people who look at the book, you're really going through what could happen at the national government, Ministry of Mutuality, and the foundational economy and so on, local government devolution, how could that work? Citizenship, what does that mean? We're going to come, I think, to UBI and participatory citizen income in a second, maybe. Education, you mentioned, even on finance and the role of central banks, very interesting to look at it. We won't have the time here, but I want to focus on business. You're very critical on the notion of CSR. So can you maybe articulate for us a little bit, how could businesses become part of this institutional democracy? Make this kind of point. So how would you configure a good business, if there was one, in the context of your institutional democracy? What role can businesses play? How should they configure it in the notion of institutional, industrial democracy, etc.?
Well, they should deliver on their values, not merely on profit. So that there should be some kind of mission statement, constitution that commits them to values and service to the community, however that may be defined, beyond profit, that they should, and there may be thresholds of for people to participate here, maybe that a period of service, but employees should be involved in the decision-making processes. I'll leave that there rather than qualify it. I think more than just developing in thinking in terms of the leader, maybe the owner or the manager, should be aware of that people develop or not as human beings in terms of their potential, and that is a theme I've stressed strongly, the development of what can be achieved in an individual, that the managers should be aware that that is taking place, as well as hopefully competence in the job. So if they spot that somebody is becoming unreasonably authoritarian perhaps in a position that doesn't warrant it, or somebody else is clearly going through an episode of self-doubt, a good leader will have the sensitivity to pick that up, which is not to say they become a social worker, but there are human beings working in all contexts, and that needs to be considered. And beyond that, as I said, there was a failed attempt in the 70s and the back end of the Callaghan government, I think it was, for very significant worker representation, and also expert representation as well on the corporate governance. It didn't get through very sadly, but it was for. It's an important point. It seems a little tangential, but for corporations of over 2,000 employers, that might well have produced quite a different Britain than shortly afterwards Thatcher formed and shaped. I think potentially a much less strife-torn country.
I mean, here you're of course also playing versus co-determination, and German sociologists have shown that this co-determination, whilst not always being efficient, whilst also you still have power issues, but what it did for the country is that the industry, of course, was kept in the country. So they had much more, the industry is much more alive and kicking because of the Rhineland model. In that sense, that probably would have changed a lot. But I heard something else in what you were saying. And that is interesting because with all what you're saying, we need more participation, we need more co-determination, we need more power distribution. You're not shy, you still say we also need leaders. So maybe we are going a little bit towards that, because that's already moving us a little bit towards the transformation section. A lot of people we have spoken to, which are coming maybe more from the stance that freedom is important and the power distribution is important, they often shy away from leadership. So I'm interested in your view. Do we need leaders? How do we make sure that we have good leaders? Who is guarding the leaders? Yeah, that I just find a very important topic in that whole transformation space.
I think leaders, in addition to what I said, I think they need a vision beyond themselves. It must include the company, the firm they're working for, and I think increasingly we're thinking of businesses in terms of the community. I think my concept of it is perhaps a little bit more ambitious than just social responsibility. It's tying them down to, this is what you said you'd do it, or if you can't do it, meet with us. That should be structured. So I mean, I do recognize that experience and competence and slightly perhaps shakier ground, character. Because the character of political leaders has been woeful recently. I mean, it's only a judgment, but I mean, Trump and Putin, and I won't mention our own dear Prime Minister.
Yeah, please do. I mean, yeah.
Get arrested.
I don't know how. We're going to get the blood pressure issues if we go too much into English politics. But so I think that's indeed very interesting, and it's a constant debate, because sometimes in these radical participatory movements or anarchic movements, there is and that's, I think, came a little bit across with you as well. They don't like rules. Secondly, they don't like leaders, and we know from all the research that leaderless organizations don't exist and don't work. So there's always leaders and leadership, right? So
I think I've moved towards what you're, dare I say, regarding as common sense in a good way. I personally am allergic to leaders, but that's just me. Right from the beginning,
that's why you were a professor. I mean,
yeah, the collegial organizations. We heard a lot about that by Paul Adler. But I think that what the objection, and I think people to a degree are projecting a lot, so they don't want to be told, they don't want to suffer, as Antoinette says, they don't want to sacrifice. Yeah, but if we want to live in a society together where everybody flourishes, we cannot just think about ourselves. And leaders, as you say, as long as they guard that common good, rather again being just acting in their own interest, so this notion of character, I think is really what the only thing we can hope for, because we want leadership in a Peter Senge way. And it's interesting, Peter Senge is doing a speech next Monday at the University of Hull, I think, and his notion was leadership is the capability, the capacity of a people to create their future. That's the type of leadership we want, as long as the future is good. And here we go to I think the final section, and thanks for bearing with us. We've been pulling you all over the place. Transformation, how do we get there? And I really like some of the things that you state. So firstly, you start by saying it's not enough to oppose a broken system. Hallelujah. Yes, academics cannot just sit in the ivory tower. They actually kind of need to be propositive, so to speak, in making practical suggestions. And then you say, what is needed is a different, coherent, and generally social philosophy. And you're building a lot on this narrative, right? So there's a need for a powerful narrative, a frame, and you're proposing the IOTA model in one of the essays. IOTA being identity, the opposition, the coherent theory, and then the alternative model. And I thought it was interesting because the second point you say, we need kind of concrete different models of economic welfare and then policy ideas that are consistent with the political forces that might champion them. And this notion of opposition, right? So the way you analyze popularist movement is really this, there's some opposition that gives energy for the movement to do something better. So I'm really intrigued by, so what is this new narrative? If you had an elevator conversation and someone asked you, Mike, all this work, what is that new coherent social philosophy that you would want to sell to the people out there? Secondly, how can you harness, as you described, this movement idea? How can you harness the energy in social movements or social organizations together with party politics or whatever is required to really make changes happen?
Okay, I pull me back if I wander too far from the point, but one of the points I haven't got across is in this subsidiarity is that I recall Ulrich Beck, the theorist of risk society, arguing that in quite a forlorn way that we need to, in his terms, to institutionalize cosmopolitanism. And because I started at the bottom in terms of democracy, and it needn't, in my view, necessarily always be direct participation. it moves up or it comes down. I think the League of Nations, the United Nations needs increasingly to move in Beck's terms, because we are in danger of not only self-harm but self-annihilation. It needs to have a great deal more power. There's not just the climate issue, there's the nuclear issue, there's a huge refugee issue. Nation states, and it is the United Nations, but they need to bite the bullet and pool sovereignty. So my argument is, I've had to humbly accept that it's not possible for everybody to participate in everything. That does have to be, has to be tiered. There has to be subsidiarity. Now, I started at the bottom because that has the potential to involve more people, and I'm fairly open to. Institutional democracy is not an ideology. It's a commitment, not beyond democracy. It's not stipulating a bunch of ideas beyond democracy. If there are democratic systems that work, and they will have to vary according to context and number of people involved, then it's democracy that I would emphasize as, because it's a relatively freeing pursuit. Democracy. It pertains to individual equality, but in a social context. So I've mentioned quite a number of democratic means. It's because power has been so centralized, not just in government, but I've addressed the economy as well. Just the cultural situation only through education I've addressed that, but it could be addressed. I mean, there is a great culture war, but that pertains to the wider split in society.
Extremely, I could listen for a very long time, but I'm also a little bit looking on the time clock, and I think what you just described again very nicely, that we need this bouquet. It's a bouquet of different arrangements, of different alternatives of organizing, a lot of strengthening of democracy. But you also say in your book, and now also, that we also need to think about the actors we already have, be it the United Nations, be it the central bank. We have to think about how to reform the representative democracy. And I think that comes out very strongly what you're saying, and also in your books. But I have one headache left, and my headache is, in order to pull that through, we probably need to unite these different movements, which together could have the force to bring things like that up. And what I have found out so far in my very limited experience to bring together the different movements is, it is extremely hard, because these are all ideology driven, and the more we stick to our ideology, the more we love our ideology, the more it's difficult to bridge towards even just a slightly different ideology. I've learned that. So here I really would like to know, because also with all your experience, how can we manage that? How can we really manage to build bridges, to see the common ground, to let go of our egos and see what we could reach together? What would be your suggestion here?
Okay, well, I think the catalyst of necessity, I think, needs to be a political party, and it needs to access power. I mean, ideally, I'd like in this country at any rate, to have a constitutional convention and let's say a victorious Labour Party or coalition. To one of the things in terms of democracy is to get rid of the House of Lords, which is ridiculous in this day and age. I can notice that Prince William actually is talking about but accepting that many Commonwealth countries will just get out of it's no longer relevant. So it's just a parallel, similar sort of situation that it's undemocratic. There is I don't know if you've heard of an organisation called Compass. It's basically a civil society organisation, but with a political purpose. It's committed. Its big thing at the moment is to get cross-voting at the local elections and in the national election, so that if in a given constituency, if a Labour representative is the main challenger to a Tory, she will get the Liberal Dem support, that the parties will agree to that. This has happened quite a bit already. That speaks to cooperation and to the fact that the scale of changes that I and other people are talking about require a very broad basis of support. It would be we've still got the House of Lords. Having a taxation system that redistributes to communities that then act as Preston or Plymouth is a big deal. It's the social license. These things are not going to happen. I don't want to say in my lifetime, but they're not going to happen quickly. It's like Deutschke, who paid the price for his radicalism. It was a long, hard march through the institutions and changing the institutions and new institutions. Nobody said it's going to be easy. Well,
very interesting. And I think this brings us almost to the end. As is usual, we're going to kind of try to close the session with a little quiz for a 1 minute kind of quick answers, whatever is on your mind. But let me just try to, before we do that, go around the table and just see kind of what are the main things we're taking away, or are there any other things we haven't said throughout the sessions which are important, to kind of crunch it up for everybody who's been listening. And again, Mike, I really want to thank you for having been with us and allowing us to really take you all over the place.
Well, obviously, my emphasis is on democracy. I believe if people are selfish as well as creative, then I think they know best how to pursue their own interests, but if they've got the power to do it. I'm not trying to abolish self-interest, perhaps selfishness, yes. So democracy, share common needs and deal with them right from the global level, which is increasingly worrying, to the local, which matters to people.
Antoinette?
Yeah, I mean, what I take away with is that we should go on cultivating even more of these alternative types of organizing, and maybe really come up with templates and spread that, so bottom up. I believe we need clearly top-down changes as well. And here for me, two things stick out, and I think we just need to probably find out how we are going to find a way to accelerate that. First of all, again, how can we bring disparate movements together? Here also shout out to all of the movements. Let's forget a little bit about our own egos and try to unite to some degree. And the second thing is leadership. I mean, we shouldn't be shy to use use people who are using power wisely. Of course, I hear you, and that is completely what we are looking at in our project as well. Good character is needed. So we should select our leaders much more wisely, and we should also abolish them much more quickly if they don't have a good character. But I think we shouldn't be shy to use leadership for this transformation. That would be, we shouldn't give that over to those who are certainly not using leaders with character. Let's put it this way.
Yeah, and I think I'm in the same boat. I think this, I think you call it tripartite rebalancing, resonates very much with Henry Mintzberg's rebalancing society. We need responsible business. We need much more active plural sector, as he calls it, and we need a good state. Now, I think we really need all those three components. The citizenship, I'm very troubled. I think we need that strong vision. We need a new social identity, which is always very hard, and we need to convince people that it's worth going there. Political class, I don't know what to say. I've lost faith, right? I think some of the troubles we're finding ourselves in is not because of big business running the world in a nasty way. It's also because of the weakness of our political leaders in maintaining that dual movement that Polanyi described, standing up for what is right and doing party politics. And Bruno Frey, to a degree, told us about theories in terms of the voting behaviors and electoral kind of optimization of political parties and so on. So that actually enforces my belief that businesses are so powerful in this corporate society that we're having. I do believe we need to, there are many people in business who want to do good. And I really think there is a potential to make much more of the businesses, the good businesses, as a coalition of the willing, who can help with creating a different context. Because they are the mini policies, the mini societies of our today's world. We shouldn't fool ourselves. So I think, and the other thing I'm taking away from the conversation is, again, this idea of combining social movements with political parties / political action. And I think the beauty that you're describing of bringing this idea of democracy everywhere. I do believe there needs to be a clear, strong, ethical, moral aspect on top of that. But I think it's the notion of eudaimonia and the notion of freedom in the Amartya Sen sense are very combinable without becoming collectivist and dogmatic. So I think we need to work on this narrative. But it has been very exciting to prepare for this interview because there's so many ideas. And I think what you are doing, Mike, a big compliment, and Bryn, very well, rather than saying this is my opinion and go here, you have created a little bit of a bouquet of, it's all in the same direction, but different flavors of the same thing. And I really appreciated that. So in that sense, a quick closeout, if you allow us, Mike. 5 questions with whatever comes to your mind as a quick answer. So to create real change in the way that you describe it in the next decade, who would you choose to spend some time with? A, Jeremy Corbyn in creating the next version of the Labour kind of ideology, Labour Party program. The Pope Francis to work on Economia di Francesco, so this economy of Francis, of Francesco, to create a new economy inspired by Catholic social values. Ursula von der Leyen to work on the social policy 2.0 for the European Union, or would you try to meet up with Greta Thunberg and work on how you can bring that red plus green movement closer to politicians? Where would you go?
I go with what I hope is the future, Greta Thunberg.
Greta Thunberg it is. We will tell her if we ever get to speak to her. Very interesting. And I like this red plus green notion. It's very interesting. Wow. If you had to choose, would you go with Karl Marx, Polanyi, Max Weber, Foucault, or John Rawls?
Polanyi.
Polanyi, not surprisingly, given that you are citing him a lot. Now, better societies need what? Better leaders, better institutions, better citizens, or better stories?
Better institutions.
Better institutions. Again, not surprisingly, and I think many people would find that not the normal way of thinking. So I reckon that's really important. UK, US, Germany, or Greece?
For some reason, I can't discern Greece.
Greece? Again, we are writing a lot about Varoufakis and the Greek movement, so clearly there's some affinity. Here's an interesting one, which we didn't get to discuss. Universal basic income, or as you call it, citizenship income, participatory income, yes or no, and why?
Yes, because it frees people up from necessity for the basic needs and lets them contribute, hopefully, to the community. That may be a condition, but also explore the best in themselves. So always the balance of the social and the personal. But yes, that's why. Yeah.
Very interesting, because Paul Adler, advocating democratic socialism, he said, no, we've got enough to do. We're not going to pay people for doing nothing. But I think you're saying almost the same, because he said it's conditional on some contribution. So I think interesting to see the different aspects. And final, our usual question, if you had a magic wand and could change one thing in the world or recommend one thing to the people watching, what would it be to make the world a better place? Of course, is intended.
It's a bit wordy, this, but I'd reduce to a minimal functional level human suffering, particularly children.
You would reduce the suffering in the world with your magic wand. Is there anything that you want people to contribute to make that happen?
For their wealth, not all of it, but the wealth that would. Well, I'm trying to be practical. I can't ask God to intervene, but resources for expenditure on health issues, because a lot of suffering is down to health or hunger or whatever. So they're very rich to deal with that problem. It is actually about time they moved in that direction.
Very interesting. And with that, Mike, I will only again say it's been brilliant. It's been exciting, stimulating, and wide-ranging. So I want to say a big thank you for making the time. And again, thanks for Bryn for trying to be here today. It's been a pleasure. And of course, we wish you good luck with the continuation. You said the Progressive project is still evolving. So good luck with that. Would be lovely to stay in contact, as I think we've got many common themes. And Antoinette, anything to add?
No, I just wanted to thank you that you took the time. And I know that we can be quite difficult because we always two and kind of shooting around the questions. So it's always, you're great sports that you played that with us. So it's really very nice and it was very interesting. Also, of course, the lecture. And you make me go back to people like Streeck and so, and it's really good. It's good that we have to look at all these alternatives. I find it great. Thank you.
Thank you for your great contributions as well, and for the conversation. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Wonderful. And with that, we close the session. And again, everybody, please get involved. Have a look at the website for all the resources. Mike and Bryn's books, of course, will be on the website, but also many other texts that we have mentioned throughout the session and that we've used in the preparation. And as I think Mike also said, get on board. We need a movement of movement. So waiting for you. Let's make these good organizations real. Thank you very much, everybody. With that, goodbye. Take care.